This evening's discussion, as you know, will center on the objectivist theory of volition. It will be concerned with elaborating the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness. This theory is central and basic both to objectivist philosophy and to objectivist psychology. What is meant by the statement that man is a being of volitional consciousness? Well, I will ask you first of all to consider the following. In a previous lecture, I have discussed the fact that there are three basic cognitive units or forms of awareness that characterize man's consciousness: sensations, perceptions, conceptions. And I have discussed the fact that the process of integrating individual disparate sensations into percepts is done automatically by the nervous system and the brain. That is, sensations flow into the organism. These are automatically integrated and related, enabling man to be aware of reality perceptually. That is, to be aware of objects, of entities. I then discussed how man moves from the perceptual level of consciousness to the uniquely and distinctively human level, the conceptual level, by integrating his percepts into concepts, then integrating his concepts into still wider abstractions, and so forth. Now, the first level of abstractions or concepts, the awareness of such phenomena, let's say, as green or hard or soft, these also take place automatically and universally in any normal brain. That is, these most primitive of concepts, which are the building blocks of all subsequent thinking, these too appear to be integrated automatically by the brain. By that I mean, there's no way that a normal person could escape forming such fundamental primitive concepts as green, brown, red, hard, soft, etc. The category, in a word, of attributes which can only be defined ostensively. In other words, that level of concepts which constitute, as it were, generalizations of direct sensory experiences, which are one step away from percepts. For example, if one looks at three different green objects and forms the concept green, well, here we deal with a very easy, very elementary, and just about inescapable kind of concept that no normal brain could escape forming. Beyond this level, however, the brain no longer produces concepts automatically. That is, as soon as you rise above this most primitive level of concepts into the genuine sphere of the conceptual faculty, in a word, as soon as the infant is functioning on the level where thinking can said to have begun, we are no longer dealing with a cognitive process that functions automatically. Whether or not the infant, the young man, the adult, will think or not to think, this is an act of choice which he has to make. It is not a function which is forced upon him or determined or necessitated by his nature in the sense in which the integration of his sensations into percepts is automatic. Putting it another way, you have only to open your eyes and you cannot escape seeing objects and entities. That is automatic. But in order to think, you have to do something. You have to generate effort. You have to focus your minds. You have to choose to set the machinery in motion. You have to choose to seek to understand that which is not immediately given, that which is not self-evident, that which is not inescapably there in your immediate sensory experience, but rather that which you must reach by a process of conceptual reasoning. To quote from Galt's speech, quote, "Man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort. But you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival, so that for you, who are a human being, the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think." Close quote. In this choice to think or not to think, to focus one's mind or not to focus it, to assume the responsibility of the conceptual level of consciousness or to evade it, and in this choice alone is man psychologically free. That choice, once made, does not continue to direct man's mind unceasingly thereafter, with no further effort required. Just as the state of full mental focus must be initiated volitionally, so it must be maintained volitionally. The choice to think must be reaffirmed in the face of every new issue and problem. The decision to be in focus yesterday will not compel man to be in focus today. The decision to be in focus about one question will not compel man to be in focus about another. The decision to pursue a certain value does not guarantee that man will exert the mental effort needed to achieve it. In any hour of his life, then, man is free to suspend the function of his consciousness, to abandon effort, and to let his mind drift in will-less passivity. Or he is free to maintain only a partial focus, grasping that which comes easily to his understanding and declining to struggle for that which does not. Now consider this concept of focusing the mind. It is a state and an operation which each one of you is able very easily to discern introspectively. You all know what it means to be in a state of kind of vague, floating, or dreaming, thinking about nothing, and then suddenly to attend to some particular issue, mentally to attend, to focus, to aim your cognitive faculty, as it were, in a certain direction. To say to yourself now, grasp this, make this intelligible, understand this. A simple example is one that you encounter every morning when you're waking up. You wake up and you're a bit drowsy, and you feel as though your consciousness is rather splintered, perhaps for a few seconds or minutes or hours. And at some point, presumably, you say, in effect, well, now, what do I have to do today? And you begin to think over what is ahead of you this day and what you have to attend to. That's an act that you can catch, a very easy kind of act of focusing your mind, of making yourself fully conscious. There are many other examples which I shall discuss reflecting the same basic choice, to think or not to think, to focus or not to focus. But in order to appreciate in a biological context this distinct human faculty, before proceeding with a further description of what the volitional faculty is and how it functions, I want to give it the following brief biological context. A basic characteristic of the actions of living organisms, of all living organisms, as distinguished from inanimate matter, is that the actions of living entities are goal-directed. That is, they are self-regulated action moving towards a certain end or goal. Now, obviously, when we deal with unconscious, or more precisely non-conscious organisms like plants, we don't speak of the goal as something which the plant holds since it has no mind, but that we, looking at the outside, can see that there is a logic governing all of the actions of the plant or the tree or the shrub. One can see a unifying principle at work, and we see that the principle of life is always an integrated series of complex actions taken in that direction which will promote the growth and the survival of the organism. For example, you all have seen the perhaps instance of a plant beginning to grow in the direction of the sunlight, and then perhaps a boulder rolls over part of it, and it begins to grow around the boulder, as though there is a clear principle directing it, and it has a certain highly limited ability to vary its motion or its direction to end up in the same place, that is, in a place where it will be in reach of the sun. Or we know of many experiments where scientists interfere with the normal processes of the growth of a tree, and within certain limits we see that the living organism has a certain flexibility to vary certain of its actions in order to end up with the same result. This is well known in biology, of course. You can observe it internally on the vegetative level of your own bodies. That is, a very complex series of actions go on constantly within your own bodies, all organized in an immensely complex way to add up to one result, namely the preservation of the life of the organism. The action is not random. It's highly structured, it's highly organized, and what you observe is that the life principle, whatever we may yet have to discover about it, the life principle possesses as its key characteristic this aspect of goal-directed, self-regulating action. All living organisms, however simple or however complex, exhibit it universally. That's entailed in the very nature of what it means to be alive. Now, observe the transition from a plant to an animal. What you observe as an increasing complexity in the type of self-regulation which becomes possible. On the vegetative level or the plant level, you get an internal chemical, internal structural kind of regulatory activity. But you see a more complex expression of the principle of self-regulated action as soon as you enter the realm of conscious animals. Why? Because we observe that consciousness is the regulator of the action of the organism viewed as a total entity. What would be a simple example of this? Well, something very easy. Your cat or dog is walking across the room, and there's a carton in the middle of the living room. It sees it, and it walks around it. That's the simplest example of where consciousness is regulating and guiding the action which the animal is taking. The animal, of course, depends for its survival upon its sense of smell, and of course its sense of smell is one aspect of its consciousness. So we see animals guided by their sensations, which obviously carries implicitly in it our recognition that an animal is guided by its form of consciousness. Now, an animal's consciousness is passive in that it can react to external stimuli and according to how it reacts, being the passive recipient of messages coming in from the outside, it will, within limits, regulate the action which the animal will take accordingly. Animals are distinguished from plants, of course, by virtue of the fact that they can move, that they're not anchored to one spot, and their consciousness guides them in this process of motion. And so here, when you enter the animal realm, you observe a higher, more complex type of life organization and a more complex kind of self-regulated action. Now, when you deal with man, you deal not only with consciousness, but with a particular form or kind of consciousness to which we give the name mind. Man possesses a mind, a reasoning faculty, a capacity to think, to abstract, to conceptualize. And now you observe, with a corresponding increased complexity of life organization, a new kind, a new advance, a still more complex form of self-regulatory action, namely, a being who is able to regulate the action of his own consciousness. That is what it means to say that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Man can direct his consciousness. What do I mean when I say that? Well, most of you, or many of you, probably own pets, and that will help you to give a concrete sense of what I'm talking about. A pet hears a sound and it jerks its head in that direction. Animals are entirely dependent upon and tied to the cues in their sensory fields. They don't think up problems to solve. They don't say, what will I think about today? And they certainly don't say, I'd rather not think about that today. It's too upsetting. Their consciousnesses are passive reactors to the stimuli which they receive. But one of the important distinctive attributes of man's consciousness is that man has the power to regulate his own consciousness, to regulate its action, to in effect decide in what direction it will go. Putting it differently, to decide whether or not it will think, whether or not it will turn the conceptual level or focus on at all. The basic act of self-regulation possible to a human consciousness is to direct that consciousness aimed in the direction of being aware, of being optimally conscious, of seeking to understand that with which it is dealing, or to suspend conscious focus, to go out of focus, to induce an inner fog. That is the basic self-regulatory option which a man has over his own consciousness. Putting it differently, what man controls is the primary goal. What he directly and volitionally controls is the primary goal or end which his consciousness is to pursue. And there's only one basic choice. Either, in any given issue, a consciousness seeks to know, to grasp something, or it fails to, or evades the effort, or evades the responsibility of seeking to grasp. And this is another way of saying that man's basic choice is to think or not to think. Now let me concretize further what specifically this choice is and means. There are three fundamental expressions of the choice to think or not to think. Three different cardinal forms in which that issue presents itself to man. The first and the most general I have already indicated, namely, to focus, to seek to understand, or to remain in an internal state of fog, or to induce the state of inner fog. That is the basic fundamental choice, to focus or not to focus, to seek always to understand, to seek always to widen the range of one's awareness, to seek mentally to grow, to expand the reach of one's consciousness, or not to bother, or to say it's too much work, or it's too painful, or I don't want to know, it'll be inconvenient, or whatever the case may be. Another form in which this choice, this same choice, presents itself to man occurs any time he experiences a conflict or a clash between his mind and his emotions, or his reason and his feelings. That is, any time he finds that he should do something because it makes sense, but he doesn't want to, or he wants to do something, or desires something, or fears something, even though he knows it is wrong or irrational to do so. Then the question is, does he remain in mental focus? Does he preserve his conscious knowledge and consequently be guided by that? Or does he suspend his conscious knowledge? Does he render his conscious knowledge inoperative in order to drift under the passive sway of his feeling, emotion, or desire? And that, again, is the choice to think or not to think. If a man wants to do something which is irrational, he has to turn off his mind, turn off his critical faculty, suspend his consciousness, and shrink his awareness down to the fact that he wants it, period, and make himself blind to and unconscious of anything else, which means he has to go out of focus. He has to cease to think. The third basic form in which the choice to think or not to think presents itself to man is the issue between his consciousness and the consciousness of others, the issue between intellectual sovereignty or dependence. That is, will he seek with his own mind to understand that which is true, and when he has formed judgments, remain loyal to the best of his own honest understanding until and unless he has reason to revise his judgments? Or will he abdicate the responsibility of independent thinking, of independent judgment, and accept passively and uncritically the views and the judgments of other people instead? These, then, are the three fundamental forms in which man comes up against the question to think or not to think. This is the nature of the self-regulatory action which man performs with regard to his own consciousness. This is the nature of the control which one has over one's own consciousness. You see, in a certain sense, one's consciousness or mind is always doing something, even if only little random thoughts or feelings are flicking through it. Something is happening at all times. Life is always action in some sense. Now, the option or the choice then consists of determining or controlling or directing the goal which the action is to take. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose you come into this classroom tonight and you're sitting and your mind is just floating and popping around from subject to subject, and let's say that it's not thinking about anything in particular. And then you look up and you see that the lecture's about to begin. And you tell yourself, in effect, well, now it's time to concentrate and pay attention if I'm to understand this lecture. Well, now, in that moment, a choice has to be made. You have to, in effect, decide, now I am going to set my intellectual machinery in a certain direction aimed at a certain goal, namely, the goal being to understand what Mr. Brandon has to say and to judge it. Now, for most of you, that process occurs so naturally that you're not even aware of it when it happens. And yet there was a moment for each one of you when you had to, in effect, aim your consciousness in the direction of the words I'm now saying, and implicitly give yourself the order, grasp what he is saying. Now let's take an imaginary example which will illustrate the three variants of the choice to think or not to think. Suppose I begin to speak, and you at a certain point find that in order to understand, you have to maintain a very clear mental focus, and you cannot doze off and just float for a minute, because if you do, you're going to lose the train of thought. And suppose you then say, well, it's just too hard, it's too much trouble, it's too much bother, thinking is such a chore, and you let yourself go out of focus. Well, that's one variant of the choice to think or not to think. Let's pick another example. Suppose that you are focused and you are thinking along with me, but at a certain point, a certain connection falls into place in your mind. Suppose you're intelligent and you're thinking ahead of me, and at a certain point you realize, well, if I get the direction of where Brandon is going, or what one of the implications of what he's saying would be, if indeed the choice to think or not to think is volitional, then that means that on those times when I acted irresponsibly, like a drunken driver without knowing what I was doing, it was my fault. A volitional irresponsibility is involved. Oh God, that's an unpleasant thought. I don't like the implications of that line of thinking he's developing. I better get out of here. Well, you don't physically leave, you just put your mind out of focus. That is an example of the principle of reason versus feelings. What is it that matters most? To grasp whether it's true or false, or to be driven by how you happen to feel about what might be the results of it being true or false, respectively? Suppose that you pass both hurdles. You remain in focus, you're not afraid of using your mind, and you're not afraid of the consequences. But at a certain point, you remember that in college you were told by your sociology teacher that everybody agrees today that man is responsible for nothing and can help nothing. But Brandon up there, it suddenly occurs to you, is saying, that isn't true. It's not true that man is a helpless pawn of fate or circumstances. But everybody says he is. Why the devil should I have to decide? I better get out of here. And so you go out of focus and cease to hear me. That would be three examples, all dramatizations of the choice to think or not to think. Now, it is very important in understanding the principle of volition and how it works to distinguish this basic choice to focus one's mind and to think from the question of what sort of things one will choose to think about. Because obviously the sort of things one will choose to think about in any day or week or month will depend upon a wide variety of factors, one's interests, one's values, one's context, one's problems, etc., and so forth. They are not chosen as primary acts of free choice, meaning that if on any given day you wake up and you decide to be in full focus, that is what volition directly pertains to, the decision to be in full focus. But, assuming you are in full focus, you don't decide in that primary same way, in a vacuum, so to speak, what you will think about, because obviously in any given day you have a context, you have continuous problems, you have a life, you have interests, you have values, etc., and so forth, and they will obviously be relevant to what you will choose to think about. Let's give an example. I wake up early this morning, and I focus, and I habitually ask myself, well, what's the program or the agenda for today? What am I going to be concerned with today? And within a second, what comes into my mind is that I am writing an article for the Objectivist newsletter, and that I must finish it by a certain date, and I remember that there are certain tricky problems, and when I stopped working yesterday, I was stuck on something, and there are problems I have to solve today and get on with the job, And as I'm getting up and shaving and brushing my teeth, my mind is going to the article when I'll be at my desk in a few minutes and remembering where I left off yesterday, and perhaps I'm imagining different ways I could try to express such and such a thought. Well, once I am in focus, it's very natural that I find my mind going specifically to the subject of that article, since that right now is my immediate concern. I don't say to myself in a vacuum, well, today now then, what shall I think about? My article, or deep-sea diving, or polo, perhaps, or crab fishing? Well, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? All of those other choices are not primary choices. They're not direct, free choices. They obviously depend upon a great many antecedent factors, to repeat, your values, your problems, your context, etc., and so forth. Now, there is a question which I am often asked about this choice to think or not to think, and which I would like to discuss with you. Students will often ask me some variant of this question. Doesn't a man have to be thinking already in order to choose to think? If you're not thinking already, how do you choose to think? And there's a certain confusion in that question, which I want to clarify, and in clarifying it, I think will throw more light on this whole concept of volition. As I have said, the primary choice to think, that is, to focus one's mind, to set it to the purpose of active cognitive integration, must be distinguished from any other category of choice. It must be distinguished from the decision to think about a particular subject, which depends on one's values, interests, knowledge, and context. And again, it must be distinguished from the decision to perform a particular physical action, which again depends on one's values, interests, knowledge, and context. These decisions obviously involve complex causal antecedents, of a kind which the choice to focus does not. A man's choice to focus is a primary. It's a psychological primary, a first cause within man's consciousness. The principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness has reference specifically, of course, as I have indicated, to the human form of consciousness, that is, to the conceptual level of awareness. The perceptual level, which man shares with animals, is automatic. To be aware of the physical concretes of his immediate sensory field, man merely has to be awake, assuming, of course, a normal brain state. But to engage in an active process of cognitive integration, to abstract, conceptualize, relate, infer, to reason, man must focus his mind. He must set it to the task of active integrating. This level of awareness must be achieved and maintained volitionally. Now, here is a very important thought. The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. I want to repeat that statement. The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. To understand the process of focusing, I must discuss briefly with you the concept of levels of awareness. A consciousness can function on different levels of awareness. This concept refers to the degree of active cognitive integration in which a mind is engaged. How actively is the mind seeking to grasp everything within its range, to assimilate it, to identify it? What sort of factors will reflect varying levels of consciousness or degrees of clarity or awareness? First of all, 1, the clarity or the vagueness of the mind's contents. The higher the level of awareness, the clearer the mental contents. The lower the level of awareness, the vaguer, the more dim, unclear the mental contents. 2, the degree to which the mind's activity involves abstractions or principles versus the degree to which it's concrete bound and is tied only to immediately present concretes. It's a higher level of awareness to think in terms of abstractions and principles than to see only that which is staring you directly in front of your nose. And 3, the level of awareness is reflected in the degree to which the relevant wider context is present or absent in the process of thinking. That is, when you are thinking about a given problem, do you hold the full context in which this problem exists? Do you seek to recall and to apply everything relevant that could possibly help you to know how to deal with this? Or do you look at the problem as though you were born 1 minute before and knew nothing? And you forget all of your past knowledge and all of your past experience and try to deal with the problem as though your brain literally had begun to work only 1 minute ago. That, again, will determine the level of awareness, the level of mental advancement on which one functions. Thus, you see, there are degrees of awareness, degrees of consciousness. The alternative is not simply absolute unconsciousness or optimal consciousness. The choice to focus or to think does not consist of moving from a state of literal unconsciousness to a state of consciousness. This clearly would be impossible. When one is asleep, one cannot suddenly choose to start thinking. To focus is to move from a lower level of consciousness to a higher level. To move from mental passivity to purposeful mental activity. To initiate a process of directed cognitive integration. In a state of passive or relatively passive awareness, a man can apprehend the need to be in full mental focus. His choice is then to evade that knowledge or to exert the effort of raising the level of his awareness. Just as focusing involves expanding the range of one's awareness, so evasion consists of the reverse process, of shrinking the range of one's awareness. Evasion, meaning the blind refusal to think, the rejection of that which you know or could know. Evasion takes the form of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows that one shouldn't. I want to repeat that very important statement. Evasion takes the form of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows that one shouldn't. When a man acts and functions with his mind unfocused, we may, in certain contexts, refer to him as unconscious. This is a means of indicating that such a man is existing on a level of awareness inadequate to the requirements of human survival. That is, he is attempting to exist in a state inadequate to the cognition of reality which human survival requires. He is attempting, in effect, to exist on the passive perceptual level that is appropriate to a lower animal. But this is a specialized use of the term unconscious. For example, if you see a person acting without thinking, you might say to him, "For heaven's sake, be conscious." Well, you don't mean literally that he's unconscious. What you mean is he's not conscious enough. He's existing on a very vague, diffuse, low level of consciousness, utterly inadequate to the task in which he is engaged. Speaking literally, of course, when a man is awake and his brain and nervous system are structurally normal, he is conscious if only passively. This basic level of consciousness is given to him by nature, as it were. Volition pertains to the responsibility of raising this basic level to the active conceptual level which is appropriate to man. This, then, in very general outline, is what the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness means. Man is a being who must direct his consciousness to an appropriate level, that is, appropriate to the tasks required of reality. That does not happen automatically. Man must control that mental process. Now, when we say that man normally has the power to think or not to think, to exercise this basic choice, this basic type of self-regulatory action, I must emphasize that one always speaks in the context of a normal brain. One always speaks in the context of a normal being. Now, one very small point of clarification that might otherwise, if I omitted this, be a question for some of you. You might ask 2 points, but isn't it sometimes harder to think than other times, as for example when you're tired? Yes, indeed it is. And here we deal with a partly physical factor. Obviously, if you've been up all night, it's harder to concentrate at 7 o'clock in the morning if you haven't been to sleep yet than if you had been to sleep for 10 preceding hours. But this is obviously a physical factor, and one assumes normal conditions. What you do have the power to know, if you have been up for 24 hours, is that you are awfully tired, that you are finding it excruciatingly difficult to think clearly, and therefore that this is not the time to make any crucial decisions. That is the form in which you still remain adequately conscious. You remain conscious enough to know what your own state is and that you had best go to bed. Or again, suppose it happens that a person is immensely upset over something very painful or distressing or agitating which has happened. Well, here again, his responsibility consists of knowing that he is in that state. I am not saying that he necessarily has to or will always be able to think as clearly. Some people can to a remarkable extent, however, but I am not saying that he must always or be expected to think as clearly when he is upset as when he is not upset. But he has to be aware of the fact that he is upset, and if he feels himself that agitated and distraught, then in fact he has to say to himself and or to anybody with whom he is dealing, give me a chance to quiet down a little bit and pull myself together, and then I will begin to think about this subject or answer you or do whatever is appropriate. He still has to remain aware and can remain aware volitionally of what his own internal state is. And in that sense, that is a form of choosing to think, of recognizing in this case what your own state is, and again, of not speaking when one should remain silent and possibly say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, to continue our discussion of volition. You will appreciate, of course, that the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness is a form of free will theory. This, in effect, is a very brief summary of what objectivism means by the concept of free will. And those of you who are familiar with the many different historical interpretations which have been given to the concept of free will appreciate how radically this differs from traditional understandings of what free will means. In the January 1964 issue of the Objectivist newsletter, I did an article specifically distinguishing the objectivist theory of free will from traditional historical theories. Man's basic choice to repeat lies in his basic self-regulatory power over the function of his consciousness. the choice to focus, to think, or not to think. Man does not have the power as a primary first cause to choose his emotions or desires or to change them at will. His emotions and desires are, of course, the product of his values, and these can be altered only indirectly by rethinking his values and premises and, as a consequence, altering his desires or emotions. Now, this type of psychological freedom does not mean that man is omniscient. It does not mean that man is infallible. It does not mean that man can never make mistakes. It does not mean that man is impervious to any and all external circumstances, which is obviously absurd. There are many factors which can affect our lives, such as wars, economic collapses, which can crucially affect our lives, over which we as individuals may have no power whatsoever. Therefore, I talk specifically about a sphere of psychological freedom, which of course is crucial, because given the external circumstances and given the knowledge available to man, it is specifically the degree of his thinking which is going to determine his character and the course which his life will take. Now, this view of man's nature stands in sharp opposition to the view that dominates our culture in general and the social sciences in particular, namely the doctrine of psychological determinism. Psychological determinism denies the existence of any element of freedom or volition in man's consciousness. It holds that every action, desire, and thought of man is determined by forces beyond his control. It holds that, in relation to his actions, decisions, values, and conclusions, man is ultimately and essentially passive. That man is merely a reactor to internal and external pressures. That those pressures determine the course of man's actions and the content of his convictions, just as physical forces determine the course of every particle of dust in the universe. It holds that, in any given situation or moment, only one choice, in quotes, is psychologically possible to man, the inevitable result of all the antecedent determining forces impinging upon him, just as only one action is possible to the speck of dust. Determinism holds that man has no actual power of choice, no actual freedom or self-responsibility. Man, according to this view, has no more actual volition than a stone. He is merely confronted with more complex alternatives and is manipulated by more complex forces. The determinist concept of mind entails a crucial contradiction, specifically an epistemological contradiction. It is, or rather can be shown to be, upon analysis, a self-refuting or self-invalidating theory. And I want now to direct your attention to the nature of this central and insuperable contradiction in the determinist position. A contradiction implicit in any variety of determinism, whether the alleged determining forces be physical, psychological, environmental, or divine. It wouldn't matter whether you hold that man is controlled and determined by the gods, or his genes, or his toilet training, or a socioeconomic environment, or background, or position. This contradiction is common to all of them. Consider the following. The determinist concept of mind maintains that whether a man thinks or not, whether he takes cognizance of the facts of reality or not, whether he holds facts above his feelings or his feelings above facts, all are determined by forces outside his control. In any given moment or situation, his method of mental functioning is the inevitable product of an endless chain of antecedent forces. He has no choice in the matter. That which a man does, declare the advocates of determinism, he had to do. That which he believes, he had to believe. If he focuses his mind, he had to. If he evades the effort of focusing, he had to. If he is guided solely by reason, he had to be. If he's ruled instead by feeling or whim, he had to be. He couldn't help it. No one can help anything. Such is the determinist thesis. But if this were true, no knowledge would be possible to man, as I shall show. No theory could claim greater plausibility than any other, including the theory of psychological determinism. Why? It is most essential to understand this issue. First of all, remember that man is neither omniscient nor infallible. This means, A, that he must work to achieve his knowledge, and B, that the mere presence of an idea inside his mind does not prove that the idea is true. Many ideas may enter a man's mind which are false. But if a man believes what he has to believe, if he is not free to test his beliefs against reality and to validate or reject them, if the actions and content of his mind are determined by factors that may or may not have anything to do with reason, logic, and reality, then he can never know if his conclusions are true or false. Knowledge is the correct identification of the facts of reality. And in order for man to know that the contents of his mind do constitute knowledge, in order for him to know that he has identified the facts of reality correctly, he requires a means of testing his conclusions. The means is the process of reasoning, of testing his conclusions against reality and checking for contradictions. It is thus that he validates his conclusions. But this validation is possible only if his capacity to judge is free. That is, non-conditional, given a normal brain state. But if his capacity to judge is not free, there is no way for a man to discriminate between his beliefs and those of a raving lunatic. But then how do the advocates of determinism acquire their knowledge? What is its validation? Determinists are conspicuously silent on this point. If the advocates of determinism insist that their choice to think and their acceptance of reason is conditional, dependent on factors outside their control, which means that they are not free to test their beliefs against the facts of reality, then they cannot claim to know that their theory is true. They can only report that they feel helpless to believe otherwise. Nor can they claim that their theory is highly probable. They can only acknowledge the inner compulsion that forbids them to doubt that it is highly probable. Some advocates of determinism, evidently sensing this epistemological dilemma, have sought to escape it by asserting that, although they are determined to believe what they believe, the factor determining them is logic. But by what means do they know this? Their beliefs are no more subject to their control than a lunatic's. They and the lunatic are equally the pawn of deterministic forces. Both are incapable of judging their judgments. One of the defining characteristics of psychosis is loss of volitional control over rational judgment. But according to determinism, that is man's normal metaphysical state. There is no escape from determinism's epistemological dilemma. A mind that is not free to test and validate its conclusions, a mind whose judgment is not free, can have no way to tell the logical from the illogical, no way to ascertain that which compels and motivates it, no right to claim knowledge of any kind. Such a mind is disqualified for such appraisals by its very nature. The very concept of logic is possible only to a volitional consciousness. An automatic consciousness could have no need of it and could not conceive of it. The concepts of logic, thought, and knowledge are not applicable to machines. A machine does not reason. It performs the actions its builder sets it to perform, and those actions alone. If it is set to register that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it does so. If it is set to register that 2 plus 2 equals 5, it does so. It has no power to correct the orders and information given it. If self-correctors are built into it, it performs the prescribed acts of self-correction and no others. If the self-correctors are set incorrectly, it cannot correct itself. It cannot make any independent, self-generated contribution to its own performance. If man, who is clearly not set invariably to be right, were merely a super-complex machine engineered by his heredity and operated by his environment, pushed, pulled, shaped, and molded by his genes, his toilet training, his parental upbringing, and his cultural history, then no premise reached by him could claim objectivity or truth, including the premise that man is a machine. If, as staunch determinist such as Baron Holbach states in his work System of Nature, man's, quote, ideas come to him involuntarily, close quote, if man is, quote, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without his will being for anything in these various states, close quote, then by what right does he or any other determinist claim his involuntary ideas as knowledge? A determinist can only announce, destiny forces me to believe, etc. He cannot claim to know anything. Those who expound determinism must either assert that they arrived at their theory by mystical revelation, and thus exclude themselves from the realm of reason, or they must assert that they are an exception to the theory they propound, and thus exclude their theory from the realm of truth. That knowledge is possible to man cannot be contested without self-contradiction. It is a truth that must be accepted even in the act of seeking to dispute it. Any theory that necessitates the conclusion that man can know nothing is self-invalidating and self-refuting by that very fact. Yet such is the conclusion to which the theory of determinism inescapably leads. Thus, a rationally espoused determinism is a contradiction in terms. In appraising any theory of the nature of man's mind and its operations, it is necessary to consider this. Since the theory is itself a product of man's mind, its claim to truth must be compatible with its own existence and content. Otherwise, the theory is contradictory and nonsensical. For example, if a man were to declare as an alleged fact of reality, man is incapable of knowing any facts, the logical absurdity of his statement would be obvious. The epistemological contradiction of determinism is, in a subtler and more complex way, of the identical order. Determinism is a theory whose claim to truth is incompatible with its own contents. It exhibits what may be termed the fallacy of self-exclusion. It does not matter whether man's mind is alleged to be passively under the sway of the laws of association, or of conditioned reflexes, or of environmental pressures, or of original sin. Any theory of mind that denies man's volitional control over his faculty of judgment collapses under the weight of the same inescapable and insuperable contradiction. Only because man is a being of volitional consciousness, only because he is free to initiate and sustain a reasoning process, is knowledge, in contradistinction to irresistible, unchosen beliefs, possible to him. Now, there is one common confusion which, in the minds of many people, allows them to grant some validity to the thesis of psychological determinism. And that is the confused and entirely mistaken notion that the law of causality requires commitment to psychological determinism. It does not. I recall to your memory our discussion of causality in Lecture 3. The actions of an entity are determined by the nature of the entity that acts. It is the nature of the entity that determines the actions possible to it, and in any given context or situation, it is the nature of the entity which determines what the entity will do. Man's unique biological character, or one of the unique characteristics biologically of man, is precisely this self-regulatory power over his own consciousness, which was discussed earlier. This capacity to generate a certain kind of mental action. When we say that man is a being of volitional consciousness, we are recognizing this particular self-regulatory capacity which man possesses, and that is one of the crucial characteristics of the kind of entity man is. Man's nature is such that it confronts him with a choice which he cannot escape, which only he can make. It is not made for him by his environment or his destiny or by any external force, past or present. That is the unique responsibility which nature poses to this one species, a responsibility regarding directing the action of his consciousness. And what I want to draw to your attention, as I discussed in the earlier section of tonight's lecture, what I want you to see in this self-regulatory power of man over his consciousness is an extension of a biological principle which, on lower levels, we can see running through all forms of life, namely, in what respect life always entails self-regulated action. Here, we get a regulation concerning the action of consciousness itself, a regulation which is volitional in nature. Now, many people still think, when they think of causality, in terms of a highly limited model of causality, and that is the Newtonian mechanistic model. And that is a central cause of confusion in attempting to think about human psychology. Meaning by that the following: they think of the universe as a vast billiard table, as it were, as though everything is only moved by being knocked by something else. Now, this concept is utterly inadequate to account for living phenomena in general, let alone for man. Implicit in this notion of causality is a radically different notion of causality than the Greeks advocated or that we discussed in Lecture 3. The Greeks, such as Aristotle in particular, when they conceived causality, correctly understood it in terms of a relationship between entities and actions. A disastrous confusion in the conceiving of causality emerged in the post-Renaissance period when men began to conceive of causal relations not in terms of relationships between entities and actions, but in terms of relationships between actions and other actions. They saw every action as being only a reaction to something else. They assumed implicitly, to begin with, that the normal or natural state of entities, left to their own devices, as it were, is rest, is stillness, that motion always reflects the impingement of some outside force upon an object or entity which otherwise would be still, and hence later on this became known as the billiard ball view of the universe. And when we attempt to use this kind of a model to life in general and to human beings in particular, of course it is grossly inadequate to explain the facts that we see. You can't even explain the action of a plant with a billiard ball model, let alone the actions of a living consciousness. Aristotle correctly observed that one of the distinguishing characteristics of living organisms as separate from non-living organisms is, as he said, that in living organisms the source or origin of their motion lies within themselves. If a plant grows, it's not because something outside pushed it. Its principle of motion lies within itself. And here again, we recognize that even before we come to the question of free will or volition or man, that one has to recognize that the mechanistic billiard ball approach to causal explanation is very limited. It has relevance to many aspects of life, but it's by no means synonymous with what is meant by the concept of causality in the abstract or in general. When you say, or as you will almost certainly say to me in the question period tonight, yes, Mr. Brandon, this is all very well, but just the same, what makes one person focus his mind and another person not focus? What you are implicitly thinking of is what sort of force pushed man's mind in the direction of thinking or of evading. In other words, you will be thinking that every action is only a reaction, and you want to know a reaction to what? To what force, you will be asking me, is thinking a reaction? And that's where you have to check your premises. That is the premise that you have to check. I'm glad to see so many heads nodding, because this is a very important point of confusion about the whole issue of free will. The choice to focus or not to focus is a causal primary. It does not have causal antecedents in the same way that other choices, such as the choice to go to movie A rather than movie B, obviously have them. This I discussed earlier. It is a primary category characteristic of the human species, a primary power or capacity. And if you are tempted to say, yes, but what made one man think and another man evade? If you find it psychologically or epistemologically or metaphysically unacceptable to hold the view that this was a choice made by him which is causally irreducible in the sense in which no antecedent force drove him to it, then you can only do so from the implicit premise, held consciously and usually not consciously, that, to repeat, every mental action must be a reaction to something else. Why? The piece of dogma which you have to challenge in that notion is that nothing can originate action or originate motion. Now, although throughout history there have been many different forms of determinism, a form which is particularly prevalent today is, of course, the variety called environmentalism. Let's very, very briefly, since we're running short on time, say a few words about this issue. This is the claim, environmentalism, that man is primarily the passive product of his background and environment. It's his environment, modern psychologists assert, that determines man's character, values, action, and thinking. Man is only a walking recorder into which his parents, teachers, and neighbors dictate what they please. Such parents, teachers, and neighbors themselves being only walking recorders, carrying the dictations of other earlier recorders, and so forth. As to where new ideas, concepts, and values come from, this question such theorists leave unanswered. Or sometimes they go so far as to say there are no new ideas. Now, the general fallacy in the concept of determinism has already been stated, but let us consider a little more specifically this variety. His environment, the facts of the world around him, offer man material about which to think, but they do not determine the content of his thinking. Your perceptual experiences do not lead you to your conceptual conclusions by some passive deterministic process, as though the particular combination of percepts that you had can lead you only in one direction. This demonstrably is false. Perceptions don't have the power to transform themselves into convictions without an intervening mental process which you have to initiate and direct, namely the process of thinking. Man's life and character are determined, then, not by the things he perceives, but by the thinking he does or fails to do about the things that he perceives. If, for instance, a child is brought up by irrational parents who give him a bewildering, frightening, and contradictory impression of reality, he may decide that all human beings by their nature are incomprehensible and dangerous to him, and if he arrests his thinking at this point, and if in later years he never attempts to think this issue through again, never attempts to question his chronic feeling of anxiety and helplessness, he can spend the rest of his life in a state of embittered paralysis. But such does not have to be his fate. If he continues to struggle with his problem, or as he grows older, if he decides to think about it, to re-examine it, to consider the newer, wider evidence available to him, if, to put the issue more simply, he decides to preserve an acute mental focus, he can discover that he has made an unwarranted generalization, and he can then revise it into a fully reasoned and conscious conviction. Another child in the same circumstances may draw a different conclusion. He may decide that all human beings are unreliable and evil, and that he will beat them at their own game. He will act as ruthlessly and dishonestly as possible to hurt them before they hurt him. Again, he can revise this conclusion later in the light of wider evidence, if he chooses to think about it, if he chooses to remain in focus. If he doesn't, he will become a scoundrel or a criminal, not because his parents were irrational, but because he defaulted on the responsibility of remaining in focus, of forming his convictions in full consciousness, and of checking his conclusions against the facts of reality. A third child in the same circumstances may decide that his parents are wrong, that they are unjust and unfair, or at least that they do not act understandably, and that he must not act as they do. He may suffer at home, but keep looking for evidence of better human behavior among relatives or neighbors or in books and movies. Such a child will draw an enormous advantage out of his misfortune, which he will not realize till many, many years later. He will have laid the foundation of an inviolate self-esteem. If an adolescent grows up in a neighborhood where crime flourishes and cynically is accepted as the normal, he can, abdicating the independence of his judgment, allow his character to be shaped in the image of the prevailing values and become a criminal himself. Or, choosing to think, choosing to remain aware, choosing to go on looking at the facts of reality and to make sense out of what he sees, he will come to the realization of the irrationality and humiliating self-degradation of the people who accept a criminal's mode of existence. Of any value offered to him as the right, and any assertion offered to him as the true, a human being is free to ask why. And that why is the threshold that the beliefs of others cannot cross without his consent. But what of the individual who does appear to be the product of his background, the pawn of his conditioning? Well, let's take the social worker's favorite example. Let's consider the case of the boy who, brought up in a bad neighborhood, becomes a criminal. What are the internal mental processes that lead this poor chap into a life of crime? Very briefly, the pattern goes like this. In the actions of a boy who allows himself in this manner to be shaped by his environment, an obvious motive activating him is the desire to swim with the current. What in psychological terms does this expression mean? What does it mean to swim with the current? The boy is living in a neighborhood where crime and hoodlumism is rampant, and he swims with the current. Well, how does this happen? To swim with the current proceeds from the desire to escape the effort and responsibility of initiating one's own course of action. In order to choose one's own actions, one has, of course, to choose one's own goals. And to do that, one has to choose one's own values. And to do that, one has to think. One has to be in focus. One has to go on looking and judging. Thinking is the first and the basic responsibility that such a boy rejects. And because he doesn't choose to think and has therefore no long-range goals or standards, he is left at the mercy of the impulses of the immediate moment. He is forced to pursue short-range, immediately available goals and to seek immediately available pleasures. And this leads him, in the logic of his course, to accept whatever values are offered to him by whatever social group happens to surround him. To swim with the current, one has to accept the ocean or the swamp or the rapids or the cesspool or the abyss toward which that particular current is rushing. Having no values or standards of his own, the boy will want to swim. He will want to follow any course of action ready-made for him by others. He will want to belong. If the boys in the neighborhood form a gang at the corner pool room, he will join. If they start robbing people, he will start robbing people. If they begin to murder, he will murder. What moves him? His feelings. His feelings are all he has left once he has abandoned his mind. He does not join the gang by a conscious reasoned decision. He doesn't think it out and decide it's a logical thing to do. No. He joins because he feels like joining. He does not follow the gang because he thinks they are right. No. He follows because he feels like following. If his mother, for example, objects and tries to argue with him to persuade him to quit the hoodlums, he does not weigh her arguments and conclude that she is wrong. He just doesn't feel like thinking about it one way or the other. If at some point he begins to fear that the gang may be going too far, if he is anxious at the prospect of becoming a murderer, he realizes that the alternative is to break with his friends and be left on his own. He does not weigh the advantages or disadvantages of being left on his own. No, he chooses blindly to stick with the gang. Because at the prospect of being alone, at the prospect of independence, he feels terror. He may see across the river or just a few blocks away people who lead a totally different kind of life and boys of his own age who somehow did not become criminals. But this does not raise in his mind the question of whether a better kind of life may be possible to him. It does not prompt him to inquire or investigate because he feels terror at the unknown. He feels safe in his surroundings. They are the familiar and the known. If he asks himself what it is that terrifies him about breaking with his background, well, he would answer in effect, I don't know nobody out there and nobody knows me. In logic, this isn't an answer or an explanation because there is nothing objectively terrifying in that statement. But it satisfies him because he feels an overwhelming, unanalyzed dread of loneliness, and feelings are his only absolute, the absolute never to be questioned. And if at the age of 20 he is dragged to jail to await execution for some monstrously bloody and senselessly wanton crime, he will scream that he could not help it and that he never had the chance. Will he scream it because it is true? No. He will scream it because he feels it. In the sense opposite to that which he intends, there is one element of truth in his scream. Given his basic policy of anti-thought, he could not help it, and he never did have a chance. Neither has any other human being who moves through life on that policy. But it is not true that he or any other human being could not help running from the necessity to think and could not help blindly riding on his feelings. On every day of this boy's life and at every crucial turning point, the possibility of thinking about his actions was open to him. The evidence on which to base a change in his policy was available to him, and he evaded it. He didn't care to think. If at every turning point he had thought carefully and conscientiously and had simply reached the wrong conclusions, he would be more justified in crying that he could not help it. But, ladies and gentlemen, it is not helplessly bewildered, conscientious thinkers who fill reform schools and murder one another on street corners through an unfortunate error in logic. The policy upon which this boy proceeded is the policy on which many people proceed. He perhaps carried it to more of an extreme, or existed in an environment where that policy would prove more disastrous. Not that he never thinks. Oh, no. Everybody thinks some of the time. His policy is, I'll think when I feel like thinking. It's an unfair charge to say that some people never think at all. Nobody is ever out of focus all the time. When we say a person is out of focus, characteristically, we're talking about a person whose feelings largely determine whether he's in focus or out of focus. Certainly not reality. But thinking is not a luxury in which man indulges if and when his feelings permit it. The relationship is the opposite. Feelings take over and assert control if and when thinking is suspended. And this is the manner in which men can be determined, in quotes, by their environment. If a man chooses not to think, if he chooses to escape from the effort of focus and the responsibility of judgment, he is left at the mercy of his feelings, of his immediate subconscious reactions, and these will be at the mercy of the outside forces impinging upon him, at the mercy of whoever and whatever is around him. In this state, he is a helpless zombie passively being shaped by his environment. But he did not have to get into that state, and he does not have to remain in it. He still has the power to focus, to think, to question, and if he chooses not to, then it is he who has turned himself into the determinist view of man, that is, into an empty mold waiting to be filled, into a will-less robot waiting to be taken over by any environment and any conditioners. Most human beings, to conclude, most human beings, as I have said, are not unequivocally opposed to the policy of thinking. It would be more correct to say that thinking for most men is sort of an emergency measure. It's what you try when everything else has failed, which is usually much too late. It's a sort of a last resort. The first resort is to act on your immediate impulses or feelings, or habits, or advice that somebody gives you. If that proves inadequate to the whole situation, or if it mangles you, at some point, some men decide implicitly, well, just for the hell of it, I'll try to think my way out of this situation, at which much of the time they find they can't, and small wonder. Can't in the time necessary, that is. they could, but what could have been a task of minutes or weeks becomes a task of agonizing years if it's undertaken at all. Because they don't have the knowledge which they should have to help them in this moment, the knowledge that would have come from the thinking they didn't do. The unfortunate state of affairs is that psychologists, when they see this sort of spectacle, should be the first to point out the deadly danger of the policy of men who try to exist with as little thinking as they can get away with. But much of psychology, instead of criticizing this policy, instead of pointing out that it's a sign on the road to disease and disaster, no, instead they say, such is human nature. Man is only peripherally and marginally a rational being. They say that it's far more relevant to say that he's a feeling being, and they point to all of the wrecks in their offices as evidence. But it's not in the therapist's office that you find out what human nature is. And you don't point to neurotics and psychotics as examples of normal human functioning or behavior. This leads us very directly into the lectures of the next several weeks. Next week, Mrs. Brandon will be the guest lecturer, and as you know, she will deal specifically with the psychology of thinking, with the principles of efficient thinking. And in the following 2 weeks, I will be concerned to show you what the issue of thinking or non-thinking has to do with the issue of mental health, and from there into the subject of ethics and morality. So, to be continued next week. Thank you.